What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. Today it's leatherworking day. I'm going to show you some tips and tricks that I have for drawing up a pattern for a particular object that you can then turn around and make a cool leather knife sheath. Stick around. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. I hope you are all doing awesome. Do you guys ever feel sometimes overwhelmed with projects and you need to just do something that kind of helps you relax a little bit? For me, leatherworking is one of those types of projects that I just find really calming. There's something really relaxing to me about working with the leather. I think maybe it's the smell and the sound of it squeaking together. I just really enjoy that. So today, we're going to make a really simple knife sheath. I've got this little pocket knife here. This is some model of Swiss Army knife. And I thought we could just make a simple little belt pouch that this guy can go in. When I set out on a new project, I don't always make a mock-up, but this is one project that I actually made a sample piece just to test out some measurements. And there's some things that I didn't get right on this, and hopefully we're gonna be able to remedy that on the new one. I also didn't even stitch this. I just used some Chicago screws and just knocked it together just so I could test the proof of concept. And I found really Chicago screws are really quick and simple for making a prototype. You just punch a few holes, put the screws in, and you can really try out your piece really almost in a matter of minutes. Looking at my mock-up, I've determined that there's almost too big of a slope right here, so I think I'm gonna need to include a small welt in here. That's gonna kind of eliminate some of this taper in here. On this sheath, I cut the belt slots on the wrong side, so if you have it on your right side, this is gonna be the front. I want it to be so that this is at the front on the left side, so I need the slots over on this side. I'm gonna make some modifications and we're gonna draw up a completely new pattern, so let's jump right in and make this pattern. I'm gonna start out by just taking a couple measurements. This one's about 4 3/8 tall. I think if we go somewhere around the 4-inch mark, that'll give us some room at the end for our stitching, as well as enough at the top sticking out that you can easily grab it. So I've just drawn on 2 lines that are 4 inches apart. If you look at my crude sample, you can see that this is one piece of leather just folded over and then secured along one edge. So we need to figure out how wide to make that so that when we fold it over, our dimensions are correct. I'm gonna figure that out by just using a strip of the same leather, and what we're gonna do is fold that as tightly as we can around the top edge of our knife. I'm gonna squeeze that together as tight as I can, and we'll make a small pencil mark where the 2 pieces touch. And now as we open up our piece, those pencil lines, bam, we've just determined where our stitch line needs to be. Now I'm gonna need to adjust mine a little bit because I am gonna use a welt, so I'm gonna shift it half the width of the welt to the outside. But if you're not doing a welt, you just stitch right on your pencil line, you're gonna be good to go. And since this knife has a bit of a taper to it, around 1/4 inch difference between the top and the bottom, we need a different dimension at the bottom. So I'm just gonna wrap my same piece of leather around there, and we're gonna do the exact same measurement. Now we've got 2 sets of measurements. We just need to transfer these to our cardboard pattern. Our first set of measurements is 3.5 inches apart. We'll use this as a center line. Our second set of marks is 3 inches apart. Now since I'm going to use a welt for this project, I'm going to make my welt 3/16 of an inch wide. So I'm going to add that dimension to the outside dimensions of my template. I'm going to make the edge of the welt sit right at the original stitch line that we marked out. That way it shouldn't change the inner dimensions of the sheath. Now in hindsight, I probably should have used more like a 1/4 inch welt, as the 3/16 was just a little bit narrow when it came time to stitch. Now if I were to cut this out right now and fold it in half, we're going to have a square corner at the bottom. I want something rounded off. It's going to be a little bit more comfortable. So I probably should have rounded this before we draw the lines, but We're going to add a radius in here and then we'll correct our lines to match. Now I need to mark out the location of the slots for the belt. We're not doing any sort of folded over loop or anything. I'm just doing some simple slots cut into the back. Now on this one, when I tested it out, it worked okay, but I feel like the slot needs to move over a little bit. So I'm just gonna go off of my measurements here and we're gonna scoot that over just a little bit. Now on the pattern, I know this looks off-centered here, but we have to keep in mind that this is going to be folded, so a lot of this material is actually going to be on the back. So when it comes time, I'm going to punch a couple holes here and just connect the dots to make this little slot. The last thing I want to add is a little recess at the top, and that's just to give you a little bit more area to reach in there and grab the knife out. So we'll just mark that out, and this goes on the opposite side, so we're going to mark it out over here. Where's our round marking device? Just round that up, and there's our pattern. Now using a brand new blade and a utility knife, I'm going to cut out my cardboard template. I cut my pattern. Dang it. Cut carefully. More carefully than myself. A little word of advice, always cut towards the outside of your template. That way if you make a mistake, it's not really going to hurt your template. Like it never even happened. And we're ready to transfer this over to a piece of leather. I've got my pattern laid on a scrap of what I believe is about 9-10 ounce leather. It's pretty heavy duty for this, but I think it's going to work really good. I want it to be nice and durable, something that's going to hold its shape really well, and I think this is going to work perfectly. I'm using a sharp awl to trace out the template onto the leather. Now there's a bunch of different methods for cutting this out. You can use all manner of knives, craft knives, round knives. I'm just going to use a utility knife with a brand new blade, except we're going to step it up a notch and give it a few swipes on the strop. I found that works really well at taking a utility knife blade from being sharp out of the box to extra sharp. One tip for cutting leather, especially leather that's even a little bit heavier like this piece, is make sure your knife is super sharp. The sharper your knife, the easier it's going to cut through. I've also found that I get the cleanest cuts by doing the whole thing in one pass. If your knife is dull, you're not really able to do that. You have to make multiple passes, and that's when you kind of start to get little fuzzy bits on the edge of your leather. By going slow and cutting through the entire thickness of leather in one pass will give you the best results. Just be really careful though, and be aware of where your hand is. Never put it in the path of the blade. If you were ever to slip, you definitely don't want to run that sharp knife into your hand. Now we'll punch the holes for the belt slots. In case you're wondering, this is not the greatest pair of rotary punches. These sort of work. The reason I'm punching the holes at the ends of the slot is really it's going to relieve the leather just a tiny bit as this is worn, but the main reason is to prevent the slot from tearing on up through the piece. Now I need to cut the welt that's going to get glued in on the inside. It's going to be the exact same shape as the pattern, except it's only going to be about 3/16 wide. Just a strip that runs down almost to the center line. I'm going to leave this welt kind of wide. We'll trim off the outside once we get it secured. I did scratch a line on there so I know where to line everything up to. And I think we're ready. So let's glue this. Do you think I can find my brushes? No, we're going to use a piece of leather. If you wanted to practice any stamping or tooling on your piece, you need to do that before you start gluing it while the leather is still flat. That is definitely something that I would like to practice myself. We're just not going to do it on this piece. After about 5 minutes or so, the contact cement is just tacky enough where we can stick these together. Now we can do the same thing and glue the other side together. I think I'm going to have to wet this leather a little bit first just to make it a little bit more pliable so I can bend it into place. I need a sponge. This may or may not be necessary, but I did decide to wet the entire finished side of the leather. That way if the water caused any marks, at least the marks would be uniform. After the contact cement tacked up, it's just a matter of lining up the edges and folding this thing into place. Now I'll trim off the excess welt material and sand the entire outside edge smooth. I kind of messed up on my order of operations just a little. It's not going to ruin the project or anything, but it would have been a lot easier if I'd have sanded this little recess portion right here before I folded it over and glued it. Now it's kind of hard to get in there, but we're going to try to figure it out. Maybe a piece of sandpaper. Something. That's one thing I found, especially on leatherworking projects, you really got to think ahead to your operations that are coming up. A lot of things you can't do after you do another operation, or at least in this case, it's a little bit more difficult to do. So try to think ahead if you're doing a project like this. Really, lots of projects are like that, but I find that issues like this really stand out in leatherworking projects. Maybe that's just me. I was able to sand it smooth by just wrapping a little piece of sandpaper around a dowel. Now I'll use a beveling tool to put a small bevel around the edge. This is going to make it a lot cleaner when it comes time to burnish the edge. Now to prepare for punching, I'm going to use a set of wing dividers to scribe a stitch line that's about half the width of my welt around the outside edge. And now it's time to punch. I've run into a small problem. I was going to punch these with your standard stitching chisels, but my leather's too thick for the chisel to go all the way through. I guess I'll just punch what I can, and we'll finish it up with an awl once we start to stitch it. It's gonna be fine. Yeah, that's not the hammer. If you intended to dye your leather, you want to do that after you're done punching. I'm not dyeing this piece, but you do it before you stitch, that way you don't end up dyeing your thread. And now it's time to put our new stitching pony to work. I made this in a recent episode. If you guys haven't seen that video, I'll put a link down below in the description if you want to check it out. This thing is going to come in super handy. With my piece firmly clamped in the stitching pony, I'm going to use an awl to poke that first hole all the way through. Then I'll feed the needle and thread through that first hole. And it's back to the awl to open up the second hole, and now I can actually make my first stitch. With the first stitch started, I decided to just go all the way down the piece and open up all the holes at once. That way I can just continue stitching once I get going. I'm using a saddle stitch to sew this up. A saddle stitch involves using a needle on each end of your thread. It's a really handy stitch to know, and really you can use it for just about any sort of leatherworking project. To do a saddle stitch, you basically run your first needle through the hole that you're going to sew, and then on the other side of the piece, you're going to run your second needle back through that same hole and keep weaving your way down your piece, running both needles and both layers of thread through each hole. There are tons of great instructional videos if you want to learn a little bit more about doing a saddle stitch or any other leather work for that matter. I definitely don't consider myself a pro at this, but I can get the job done. Once we make our last stitch, I'll tie the thread off using a square knot. Just like that. We are stitched. To finish off the stitching, I'm going to tap the stitch line down using a small tack hammer. This flattens out the stitch as well as partially closes up the holes. It makes it look a lot neater and more finished. Now we need to address this edge. We need to burnish this edge so that it kind of seals it up and protects this raw edge of the leather. There are several different products that you can apply to this edge before burnishing. For me, I like to keep it nice and simple. I just use plain water. You can use a wooden hand slicker to slick this edge. It works just fine and this tool is really inexpensive. Or something that I've really been enjoying lately is one of these drill mounted units which uses your drill to power it. They work really well. The only downside to the one that I have is that it's kind of large and it's really hard to get into small curves. For those, you kind of need to use the small slicker. These drill mounted units do come in several different sizes, but this is the only one that I have at the moment. And you can see how that edge gets nice and glossy once it starts to get sealed up. And now for what I feel is kind of the fun part, we got to form this thing to fit the knife. Since I wet it earlier, the shape is kind of squashed. It's really easy to fix. I'm just going to dunk it in this warm water for just a few seconds or so. Make sure the whole thing has a minute to soak up a little bit of the water. I don't want to saturate it for, 20 minutes or something, but just enough to soften that leather. We can work a belt blank in here, kind of form the belt loop. Now we can just work the knife down in there, which will allow the leather to conform to the knife. Now, if you didn't want whatever item you're building a little case for to get wet, you can wrap it in saran wrap. It'll conform to the item you're going to use. I'm not too concerned with this, so no saran wrap this time. When I first put the knife in the sheath, it's a little bit snug, and that's actually a good thing. We want it to be snug so that we have good retention. I'm going to take a few minutes and just work the leather in around the shape of the knife. I want it to take on the contours of the knife itself. Once I get it fitting the way I want, I'm going to set it aside to dry for a few hours before wiping on a light coat of neat's foot oil. I gave the oil a couple of hours to dry, and I think now we are ready to put this thing to use. Ooh, you can even hear it click into place. Listen. I believe that's due to the fact that we molded this around the actual shape of the knife, so you get a little bit of retention just due to the shape there. That holds really well. This thing is gonna work awesome. So guys, I hope this helps you out if you're trying to design a pattern for an actual object. I hope maybe that gives you a couple of tips and tricks, maybe some suggestions for making some measurements and drawing out a pattern from scratch. One thing that I think I would do differently on this if I had to remake it would be to make the welt wider. Since I made it so narrow, it's really hard to punch in the dead center, and I actually had a couple stitches that got just a little wonky there, so by having the welt a little bit wider, I think that would make it just a little bit easier to punch, especially if you're doing it by hand like I do. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this project. I've got links to more leatherworking videos down in the description. We'll see you next time.